Hello and welcome back to another local history story. This week I'm going to tell you about a wild young man from Dundee by the name of Davy Gray. Davy never darkened a kirk door in his life. He was far more often to be seen running about in the wild, up in the estates around Camperdown, Balloony and Auchter House, where he could usually be found roaming through the forests and up the hills and poaching some fish or game to take home. And he would catch his own food this way and maybe a wee bit extra to sell around the pubs in Dundee. He was a popular young man who had a lot of friends. But of course the lairds came to despise him. Their gamekeepers could never catch Davy because he could run like the wind and his mind was as quick as his feet. And they could never quite catch him or pin him down to any crime. So the lairds of all the estates around Dundee were at a loss of what to do with him. And one night they were all together at a big dinner party and gossip and wine were flowing. And as always, talk turned to Davy Gray and how they could get rid of him for good. And at that time, the Laird of Kinpurnie suggested an unusual idea. He was building a tower at the top of Kinpurnie Hill to decorate his estate. And the fashionable thing at the time, if you had a sort of wild estate with a hill and a tower, to set it off perfectly, you would get a hermit to come and live in your tower, just a man to live by himself, a life of solitude. And your fashionable guests could come and walk past and look at the hermit. All the fashionable estates in Perthshire and the south of Scotland, they all had a hermit. So the Laird of Kinpurnie said, "Why don't we advertise for someone to come and live in my tower as a hermit? And if we put a good wage on it, Davy's sure to apply. And we can turn it into a real imprisonment." And the others all agreed that that was worth a shot. And they put in money towards finishing the tower and towards the wages of the hermit. And soon the Dundee bellman was walking through the streets of the town, crying the news. There was a hermit wanted for the new tower at Kinpurnie, and he would live there alone for 7 years. And during that time he would get all of his food and drink brought to him, and at the end of 7 years he would be given £100 and a job for the rest of his life on the estate. And when Davy Gray heard this news, I don't know quite what he was thinking. Perhaps he thought this would be his chance to get one up on the lairds himself, or perhaps he just fancied a change of life and a steady job in the outdoors. But sure enough, he did apply for it. And the Laird of Kinpurnie led him up to the tower and showed him what was to be his home for the next 7 years. And he had one small bare room to live in, and the laird handed him an old smelly sheepskin that was to be his only clothes for that time. And there was no fireplace. There was a rough bed on the floor, just a few blankets. But there was to be no water for Davy to wash himself. He had no comb or mirror. He was not to wash or cut his hair or even to cut his nails for the 7 years that he was in the tower. And what's more, he was not to speak to anyone that came by to bring him food or water. So the lairds, they were hoping that a few months of this lifestyle would be enough to break his spirit and maybe even see him off for good. But Davy Gray, he seemed to take to the life of a hermit far better than anyone expected. He had no fire, but he paced up and down to keep himself warm in the winter. And he kept to the rules, and he did not speak to the people that brought his bread and water up, but he sang to himself to keep his voice from fading. And although all he was brought to eat for years was dry bread and cold water, he did not get downhearted. And of course, the hermits were popular. And this hermit at Kinpurnie, he was far more isolated and deprived than any of the hermits in the rest of Scotland or even on the big estates down in England. So, of course, his fame spread and people would come by and look through the little hole of the window that he had to cast an eye on the famous Hermit of Kinpurnie. And he kept going like this year after year, pacing up and down and singing to himself. And at the end of the 6th year, the magistrates of Dundee all came out for a day trip to have a look at Davy, because they couldn't quite believe that he was still going. And he just called out through the little window in his cell that he would see them all next year. And at the end of his 7th year, to the astonishment and honestly to the fury of the lairds, Davy was still there. And everyone that had been there on the night when they made the original plan came to see him unlocked. And of course, far more people came from Dundee to see Davy come out, his friends from the city, and people who just wanted to see what 7 years isolation did to a man. And as the door was unlocked, Davy staggered out into the sunlight to the sounds of whoops and cheers. And you could see that although his hair and beard were down to his knees by this point, instead of the jet black that they were when he went in, they were now pale grey. And his nails, of course, they hadn't been cut either, and they were long and curved round and yellow like a seagull's claws. And Davy looked into the faces of the crowd, and there was many people there who had been good friends with him in the years before, but he seemed like he couldn't recognise a single face. And when people asked him how he felt, when he spoke, his words were strange and stilted and awkward from lack of use. But his voice became clear and strong when he made the sounds of the hill that he'd been hearing all these years. For by now, Davy could call like a crow, or he could low like a cow, he could sing like a bird, and he could bark like a fox. And he could even make the sound of the wind sighing in the trees perfectly. It was like these were his words now. And Davy was somehow more and less than human at the same time. It was like he was part of the hill itself. But Davy was released now, and he was a rich man, and he was a hero to the people of Dundee. So he was taken in a coach into the city, and people lined the streets and cheered to see him. And they found a comfortable room in a house for him to stay in, and he was given help to have a bath and wash his hair and cut his hair and nails and get him back to looking a bit more civilised. And the doctors came round and got a plan together for him to reintroduce normal food to his diet. And everyone thought that he was going to thrive after a few weeks of being back in civilization. And they were looking forward to seeing the old Davy come back. But after his release, he seemed to grow weaker instead of stronger. And he never had much of an appetite for the food that people brought him. And Davy avoided company. And when you did speak to him, he soon gave up on trying to respond in words, and he would just make the sounds of the hill and reply to anything that anyone said to him. So instead of growing stronger and coming back into normal life, after his release, Davy got weaker and weaker, and within a year of having come out of the tower, he had caught a fever, and that sadly was the end of Davy Gray. So that is the sad story of Davy Gray, the Hermit of Kinpurnie Hill. And if you go past Kinpurnie Hill, you will see there is a wee tower on the top of it. There's a slightly more historically verifiable story that the tower was built to be an astronomical observation point. So I'm not sure how the story of this mysterious hermit came to be attached to it, but it is a really vivid story. So that is the story of Davy Gray, and we will see you next week for another story. Goodbye.